All right, so we are on to our seventh session of the 2-day forum, and here's where we get to the transition we talked about. We've had a series of sessions that have been largely background, laying down some groundwork. We have certainly had some great conversation throughout it, but as we've been telling you all along, we were going to get to the bulk of today, where we would focus on what is currently clearly one of the big hot issues of the moment, which has been the drought contingency planning for the Colorado. And so Ian James now will launch a session for us that involves many of the principals who have been in the midst of that negotiation, and we'll dig into it and tell some interesting stories about it. We will have a lunch where we'll have a few speakers, and then after lunch we will be sort of looking more, okay, good, DCP seems to be coming together, but what's the longer term view? Not that I'm sure Ian will give our current panelists some chance to think about that as well, but that'll be more the focus of the afternoon conversation. So I'm going to turn things over to Ian, who is a reporter with the Arizona Republic, a fairly new addition to the Republic, and we're really pleased that the Republic has tended to have a person who's able to dedicate much of their time to water coverage, and Ian's the latest in that line, and we're glad to have him here. And one of the interesting things about Ian's role, I think many of you may know this, is the Pulliam Charitable Trust supports 4 staff. Is it 4 at the Arizona Republic? Ian and a photographer, 3. Ian and a photographer and 2
fellows.
2 fellows. And so, I mean, that's a great model of one way we make sure we continue to have good coverage of these issues. With that, let me turn it over to Ian. Oh, one other comment let me make is, so this is where we get to, as I said, some aspects of what we're doing are almost too timely. So for instance, Clint just got back from testifying, or with his boss testifying, and we weren't able to get Tom Bushatsky here, but we're thrilled to have Clint, our assistant director for Arizona, here. And unfortunately, one of the individuals on the panel who wasn't able to join us for some of these same reasons was Tina Shields from Imperial Irrigation District, and she was one of the main agriculture voices on the panel. So we'll put a little burden on Ian to make sure that voice gets heard, even though it's not sitting on the podium with everybody. But Ian,
I'll try, although I don't think I can represent Imperial at all.
Wasn't asking for that.
Thanks, Jim. And thanks to all of our panelists for being here. Commissioner Roberto Salmón of the International Boundary and Water Commission, as well as Clint Chandler from the Arizona Department of Water Resources, Leslie Meyers from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and Sandy Bahr from the Sierra Club. And I would like to ask each of them to just briefly give us an introduction of their work that relates to the Colorado River and the drought contingency plan in particular. Yes, please.
Okay. Well, my name is Roberto Salmón. I am the Mexican commissioner in the International Boundary and Water Commission between Mexico and the U.S. I have been involved with the Colorado River issues since 17 years ago. First in my capacity as the regional manager for the National Water Commission in Mexico in the Northwest region, which included the states of Sonora and states of Chihuahua and the Sonoran part of the Colorado River. And later, since 2009, in the IBWC, which basically the same year we started working in the Colorado River binational cooperation process. So I've been involved with these issues for quite some time now.
Thank you. Clint?
I occupied much of my career working for the U.S. Senate for a series of 3 United States senators, first of which was U.S. Senator Pete Domenici of New Mexico. Worked for him on the Hill. And then subsequently, I worked and had 3 different stints with Senator Domenici. And subsequently, I worked for Senator John Kyle here in Arizona and attended to water issues, among other things. And he was just and remains a tremendous mentor pertaining to water and much else, just professionally. And then after his office closed out, and I went to work for U.S. Senator Jeff Flake, and that's where I had most of my exposure to Colorado River issues before coming over to the Arizona Department of Water Resources. And we were involved on a number of storage issues, and I mean, there's quite a bit to unpack there, but had quite a bit of occasion to work with Director Bushotsky and the governor's office, and they recruited me over to state service in April of 2016, and almost immediately went to work on the DCP. Worked all the way through that year. The following year, we had the Governor's Water Solutions Conversation, which was largely purposed to help enable the approval of the DCP within Arizona. And then into 2018 and all the activity of last year. Of course, we worked with the Central Arizona Water Conservation District, and this process with which I'm sure you're very familiar, the steering committee effort that we helmed along with CAP. Director Bushotsky was a co-chair. I was his alternate with the steering committee. I led several work group meetings along with Ted Cook, and so we slogged through the intra-Arizona effort and took it through to the Arizona legislature. A lot of activity there, I don't think we'll have time to discuss every bit of that, and then through to the present. Just was out in DC this week with the director and Hunter Moore with the governor's office, and of course, as had been alluded, Director Bushotsky testified before two committees, the Senate Water and Power Subcommittee and the House Water, Oceans, and Wildlife Subcommittee Wednesday, Thursday, and we had a long series of meetings with members, with Chairman Grijalva, with Senators McSally and Sinema, and many members of the Arizona U.S. House delegation. So here I am, and I'll probably be able to elaborate a little bit about what we learned in D.C. and how we perceived what's happening out there. Mm-hmm.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Leslie Meyers. I'm an engineer. I began my career many years ago with the Bureau of Reclamation as a construction inspector on the Central Arizona project while it was under construction. Over the years, I've worked in many different capacities within Arizona with the Bureau of Reclamation, and specifically with a lot of the interstate water policy, water planning initiatives. We've been extremely involved in the DCP discussions. My boss, Terry Fulp, will speak to you more about that in the next session. And his focus has been more related on the Colorado River, and mine has been more related on CAP and intra-Arizona discussions. Been very, very involved with the state and the other parties. We created a tribal working group and worked very intensely with the tribes and included them throughout the process. And here we are today.
Hi everyone, I'm Sandy Bahr. I'm the chapter director for Sierra Club's Grand Canyon chapter. That's the Arizona chapter. Arizona has been my home for 31 years, longer than any place else that I've lived. I did grow up around Big Water, right about there in Michigan. And when I moved to Arizona, the first river I encountered was the Salt, the lower Salt, through Phoenix, and I thought, why is there no water here? It's a river. And then I learned more about other rivers, the San Pedro River, which in places is just a trickle. And I thought, well, that's not really a river, that's maybe a creek, right? And but of course, over time, I've learned a lot about how important those trickles are, especially in an arid environment like this. As far as the Colorado River goes, Sierra Club has a long history with Colorado River. Glen Canyon Dam and its existence, additional dams that were proposed that didn't happen, trying to be engaged in a way that more water would make it to the delta. And for me, just learning, that there wasn't water there in the Colorado River Delta, looking at that map of the Colorado River and just how heavily it's plumbed. And I thought, man, this is one hard-working river. And of course, over time, learning how complicated the policies around the river are. So as far as the drought contingency plan goes, I'm not a water buffalo. Not really a water expert. I'm someone who cares deeply about Arizona, about our rivers, and I am going to advocate very strongly for those. And in looking at the drought contingency plan, we thought that there were some voices that were missing and some issues that were missed, including a more holistic look at water. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Well, we're going to be talking about the drought contingency plan, and I'd like to focus on some rather maybe simple questions. It's called the drought contingency plan, but this is a river that's affected by more than drought. It's affected by the structural deficit, this disconnect between the supply and demand. That's a long-standing issue. It's affected by rising temperatures, and these will continue to have an effect into the future. But it's called a drought contingency plan. I'd like to start the discussion by posing the question of what is the drought contingency plan? What does it do? What does it not do? And in what ways can this agreement or the experience of coming to it be instructive for the future in terms of trying to deal with the issues that are only going to get more complicated? So I thought I'd start with Leslie Meyers to ask about the risks on the river and what the drought contingency plan does to address those risks, those immediate risks for the next 7 years. And I also wanted to start with one comment that I had heard from Cynthia Campbell of the city of Phoenix, who had described it as a ledge to stand on for just a while we figure out how to deal with these issues in a longer-term manner. So what can you tell us about the risks on the river and what this agreement does?
Thanks, Ian. So I just want to start off with, from the federal perspective, I think you may all know that the Secretary of Interior is the water master on the Colorado River and is therefore responsible for all of the aspects of managing, delivering the infrastructure. We work intimately with environmental users, power users, and so the risks really are significant to the river today and to the way that the river is operated. For many, many years, the river's been, the storage system and everything else has worked very well in the way that it was designed. And I think you all have heard from Dan about the river system and the hydrology yesterday. In the early 2000s, the water community came together and took many years to develop what we call the 2007 guidelines, which looked at shortage sharing criteria on the river, and that shortage sharing criteria is based on elevations in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. Since 2000, we've been in an epic drought, and we've watched the decline in the rivers, and we've come closer and closer every year to a shortage declaration based on the criteria developed in those 2007 guidelines. Over the last several years, and starting in 2013, actually, the water community came together and decided that perhaps the criteria put forth in the 2007 guidelines wasn't enough to protect us from shortage and from really critical low elevations in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. So what the DCP was designed to do, it actually is an overlay on those 2007 guidelines. As you can tell, it took many years and many voices to develop this overlay, which helps significantly reduce the risk of drawdown in those reservoirs. And it keeps us from these critically low elevations that would then, the result could be no flows in the river or very low flows in the river and very low environmental deliveries in the Colorado River. It reduces the risk of loss of hydropower development. It reduces the risk of loss of water deliveries to the contractors in the basins. And so the overall goal, really, of the drought contingency plan, even though it's a short-term plan, for the next 7 years is to significantly reduce those risks.
And it, sure.
So basically, I think, actually, I have a voice that projects. And I've often just taken off the microphone, but yeah, really, I just want to reiterate what I understand you heard about yesterday, vis-a-vis the storage situation. I think that really does provide the biggest indication of risk. When the 07 or the 24-month study came out in August, one of the things that seemed the most conspicuous to me was the big diminution in storage from 57% in the system down to 49% of the system capacity. That is a huge, so whopping big magnitude decline in storage. And I think presently it's about 45% for the entire system, approximately 40%, maybe just a little bit below 40% for Lakes Powell and Lake Mead. So it's as if your bank account is already low. You may have a good year. You know, there's been some discussion about the improved hydrology, and that is a welcome departure, right? I mean, obviously, you know, last year was a dismal year. It was deeply concerning. We're much better situated this year than last year, or significantly better off. But since our storage is at such a low level, it provides a bit of a lift, but it also places us in a situation where we could have very sudden declines, and we could go into a lower operating tier at Lake Powell, have less releases, much less flow out of Powell to Lake Mead. And if we go into that mid-elevation balancing tier, that could result in releases that could implicate about 20 foot of elevation in Lake Mead. And you have this cascading effect where you can go down, plunge down to those critically low elevations very quickly. So I think that's something that really does merit a lot of emphasis, is this understanding, this respect for the storage situation and what that implies.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Commissioner Salmón next about how Mexico has been involved in this process for the past several years. And you've been watching it for nearly 6 years now, what's been happening on the U.S. side, but then there's also been Minute 323 for Mexico's participation in this whole process. So I just wanted to ask you about how that has worked, and what do you think these set of agreements accomplish?
Okay. In 2010, we signed Minute 318, which provided for Mexico to store water in U.S. infrastructure, basically Lake Mead, because of the earthquake in Mexicali, which destroyed part of the infrastructure. And then 2011 and 2012, those 2 years, we negotiated Minute 319. And it had provisions for taking shortages, for taking cuts in the allocations when the water in Lake Mead will go below 1075. Then when we started negotiating Minute 323, at that time we had formed this binational hydrology work group with scientists from Mexico and scientists from the U.S. And they were projecting that the measures that were provided in Minute 319, which are tied to your guidelines to 2007, I think, were not enough, like she explained. So the system was, there was a probability, although very small, that the system could fail. Okay. So what should we do? So we started talking about this, the DCP. We need to take additional cuts or shortages, but it was on a savings basis. If the system will regain its strength, then we will get that water back. It doesn't happen with the shortages, okay? So we started working on that, and we decided, okay, it is better to step in and do something for the system than just stay just there watching what is going to happen to the system. So when we signed Minute 323, Mexico accepted this, we don't call it DCP, we call it Binational Water Scarcity Contingency Plan. It's like a binational DCP. Okay. So we accepted that, provided that you internally will sign among your states in the lower basin your domestic DCP. Okay? And we're waiting for that.
I have a follow-up related. I've been thinking about this after hearing from Governor Babbitt about his observations of how things have changed over the years. I wonder if you see parallels between the shift from conflict and litigation to more collaboration on the river, both within the states as well as within Mexico and the U.S. And, why has that happened at a time when there are so many political tensions between the U.S. and Mexico unrelated to water? Why is it a sort of something that a topic that there's more collaboration around?
Do you mind if I answer that question in my lunch participation?
Oh,
because
sure.
That's what I was prepared to.
Oh, okay. All right, we'll save it.
Okay.
So, and I want to go to Sandy also. What do you think about the drought contingency plan in terms of what it doesn't do in Arizona as well as in the region?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's important that we recognize that there is less water flowing in the Colorado River. And as you pointed out, it's already a river that was over-allocated. I think one of the things, so that's what it does. It acknowledges that there's less water and a framework for how to address that. What it doesn't do is really lay out a good base from which to work for the future. And I feel like what we've just talked about already is like from 2007 to 2017, things had changed very quickly. It's not enough. Just think what is going to happen between now and 2026. And so it seems to me like it's time to look at a Colorado River sustainability plan versus, and calling it drought always makes it seem like tomorrow maybe it'll be better, we'll get some more snow, I feel like a sustainability plan would be a better approach. Specifically for Arizona, our way of meeting the shortages on the Colorado River have been to throw out agreements that were made on low priority water and say, well, we're going to abandon some of our commitment to limit groundwater pumping, and not only are we going to allow more groundwater pumping, we're going to facilitate it. We'll help pay for it. Taxpayers, Central Arizona Water Conservation District ratepayers, will help pay for those pumps. And what it doesn't do is say, we have to change. We have to really look hard at what kind of agriculture we have, not to demonize agriculture, but we know it uses a lot of water. We know that that's part of the issue, and also what we're doing relative to development. The history of Arizona water is to, really rob Peter to pay Paul. Soon after the bills went through for the drought contingency plan, we saw a bill to allow more groundwater pumping in the Harquahala, for example. And not only to allow it, but to allow private water company, private investors to do it. There are so many things that I think need to be addressed more holistically. And so I can't really talk about Colorado River water without talking about groundwater, without talking about our other rivers. It's all connected. And so maybe a water sustainability plan where we're really looking at some of the fictions that exist in our law, that these aren't connected.
Clint, what would you say to some of those points that she's made about the DCP?
Well, I won't take aim at any specific element in the implementation plan. That was the groundwater piece was included as part of a big bundle. It was a compromise. Our task was to arrive at an agreement that would have the durability to withstand the scrutiny of the Arizona legislature and to ultimately gain the imprimatur of the legislature. We're the only state that had that requirement to take our portion of the DCP, if you will, due to ARS 45106, the director had to go to the legislature, and so that necessitated, and there's certain desirability about that, right? You want everybody to come together, especially given what Arizona had been asked to do. We're making the biggest cuts, and our portion of the DCP is somewhat different than it is for other states, and so we had to get to a place where we had a consensus, and that doesn't mean that everybody likes every bit of the compromise. There are things that I am very enthused about. I am very, very pleased that we all cohere to come together and with a lot of push and pull and give and take to arrive at a product that we could put forward early this year and that did receive the approval of the legislature. Are there elements that I'm not as enthused about? Sure, I'm not going to tell you what they are, but it's a compromise. It's a compromise. Overall, though, I think it is a very commendable thing what Arizona accomplished. It was a big deal. A lot of hard work went into that. There were a lot of concessions by numerous parties to drive toward that goal, and that goal, that aim, was realized in the end. So, there are criticisms, perhaps some criticisms. I'm not talking about groundwater or anything specifically, but they could be valid. In a more perfect world, basically we did a lot of hard work, and I think we came up with an overall good product.
And a question I'd like to ask everyone for just brief thoughts on is how could the process be improved, both at the state level and across the region? It has taken nearly 6 years to get to this point. At some points it seemed like it was going to fall apart. Imperial Irrigation District is not part of the agreement and has raised concerns about how it went down. So I just appreciate thoughts from all of you on how it could be improved, the planning process.
Well, I think we did a pretty good job with all the activity, all the discussion since 2013 and constructing the broader DCP. There were a lot of people of goodwill who gathered to negotiate the contours of the interstate agreement, and similarly, I think we had a good process within our boundaries here in Arizona to try to resolve issues. I think it just really should be emphasized. And I think everybody here knows, it's just hard. And so you have varying interests, and just given the substance of the discussions, water is so very important. And folks, it really concentrates thoughts, and you can have some hardline negotiating positions, but it's just a matter of problem solving. So at the interstate level, it's just a function of goodwill and time and efforts to problem solve. And then last year was an extremely complex problem solving exercise, and there were the big meetings, the steering committee discussions that were out in full view, and then there were just a lot of side conversations, people just trying to identify a path through, find a way to make it all happen. So wait.
So the only thing I would add is, and I don't know if this is an improvement, but things like this, they do just take time because they are big issues and there's a lot of interests involved. I think it started off as a smaller conversation among the states, and that took time. And that was facilitated by Secretary Jewell at the beginning. And then the states were tasked with coming back to their individual entities. And that took time. And I think what ultimately and brought consensus, and it is a consensus building process, was bringing together all the parties. And the stakeholder process was a big one in Arizona. And each of the states had their own issues, and then they came back together again over and over again. And I really think that the only way to work your way through this process is this consensus building, including all of the parties in the discussion, understanding competing interests, the concept of informed consent, what can we all do together. And I think that there was a general understanding throughout the process that we are better off with DCP than without it. It's just to what extent each individual party was willing to accept that and what it meant to that water using community, and then to find consensus in the end. And it's true, I don't know that you'll find anyone that thinks this is the best deal for them, but nobody thinks it's not anymore.
I just want to see if anyone else had any thoughts to share on that question of process. And
I would mostly address Arizona's process because that's what I'm most familiar with. And I think one of the things that is really important is to do the public's business in public. I feel like this process started out in Arizona with a lot of large behind closed door meetings that weren't open to the public. And there were a lot of parties that were missing as well. That was in 2017. And then when something was supposed to come to the Arizona legislature, it was like this big mess, this big fight between Department of Water Resources and Central Arizona Water Conservation District. And then eventually they got to a little bit more public process. But I think still with the way the process was structured, it gave certain voices a lot of amplification, and those happened to be the ones that, kind of got the best out of the deal. The Pinal County agricultural interests, who had a great lobbyist who just like every day just came and said, this is what we want. We want more money. They're going to come back and ask for even more. And so I think that, having a more inclusive process, not poo-pooing voices that bring up things like climate change, I think that's really important.
I'd like to go to Commissioner Salmón and ask about, and we do need to go to questions shortly, but I didn't want to lose the opportunity to ask you about environmental flows and sort of how Mexico's piece of the Colorado River is used. So the city of Mexicali, it's taken all the way past that to Tijuana. There's all the agriculture in the Mexicali Valley, as well as some uses for the environment. And the delta is mostly dry most of the time. But what do you think is achievable there, and what do you think the goal should be as far as environmental flows?
We are working very closely with environmental groups, such as are represented here in the second row. And they are very professional, and they come up with programs and projects and things to help the environment. One thing that I think we have accomplished in these 10 years is that the two federal governments are working together with this group of NGOs and founders and to work on behalf of the environment, which I think is good for the basin per se.
And the latest agreement has some provisions. Mm-hmm. Is there a short story to explain for people what it accomplishes, both in terms of those flows for the wetlands there and also the conservation improvements that are part of Minute 323?
I think that they themselves can do that and explain to
okay.
in their, I think it's the next panel.
Okay.
Okay, so.
Well, I'd like to go to questions and give people an opportunity to ask what you'd like to hear them address.
Commissioner, there are a variety of official and unofficial plans that would put infrastructure in Mexico, the desalination plant that Arizona talked about yesterday, the desalination plant San Diego's talked about in the past, and other ideas to tap the Sea of Cortez. What does the government of Mexico think of these ideas?
Okay, for the Arizona desalting plant, that is right now it's an idea and it's a project, a study being performed. It is considered in Minute 323, and the state of Sonora and the state of Arizona and the federal government, they have implemented a desalting plant work group, which is working towards this goal. They are now in the study process and probably will take, I don't know, a few months. I don't know if you know the time frame for the study.
I thought the study is close to wrapping up. I don't want to, that's something I haven't been as directly involved with, the Black and Veatch study. Yeah, if you have a question about that, we can get back to you on that.
All right, and then for the other one, it was included in Minute 319, and it was going to be a desalting plant that the federal governments of both countries were going to work towards constructing that plant. But the state government of Baja California decided that they were going to take over the plant, and now it's their project. Okay, so they're doing that.
Hi, yeah, so I'm Jared Smith with Freshwater News in Denver from the Upper Basin. And as the Upper Basin is getting ready to do work on its own drought contingency plan, there's been a lot of very public talk about requiring, forcing, doing whatever is needed to address the structural deficit, the 1.2 million acre feet. And the water officials early this year saying very, very strongly and very harsh language that has to be addressed if the upper basin is going to be able to convince its water users that they in fact should reduce their use as well. What's your perspective on, will we be able to address the structural deficit soon, and if not, why not?
Well, I don't want to open negotiations on the structural deficit here. That very probably, it's a good question, and I appreciate the question. So one thing that the DCP provides us with is, the director expressed it this week in one meeting with some of the folks on the Hill, is it gives us a safe space. A lot of folks really embrace that characterization. It gives us a bit of space to have these conversations. There's like a near one probability that the structural deficit will come up during the renegotiation of the guidelines. It's a given. The extent to which that we resolve those issues is going to be a matter of negotiation. And those discussions probably will commence sooner rather than later. They could begin this fall after we're informed by the results of the August 24-month study, or perhaps in early 2020, but my guess is those conversations will begin in late August or September, somewhere in that span. And that's going to be, I'm certain, among the items for discussion. So probably just have to leave it there.
Yes, just following up on that, what lessons were learned from the DCP process that are going to inform that renegotiation process?
Well, I think we have the benefit of collective action most broadly. The states cohere to arrive at an agreement, a structure that we believe will help us to reduce those risks in the interim period. And I think that just working together, that collaboration really does provide some confidence of what can be accomplished going forward. We did quite a bit of problem solving within Arizona. We may have to, continue with that. And but just the accomplishment that had been realized here with the DCP, the interstate agreement, and that determination to work collaboratively to try to work through consensus, I think has served us well. And I think having done some good things that way, and having in the past accomplished considerably by got quite a bit done working together. We accomplished quite a bit collaboratively with the DCP, and I think that provides us with a good basis going forward.
Can I just add to that? I think there's been a lot of Clint has talked kind of big picture about all the collaboration and everything else, and I think one of the interesting things about the negotiation of the DCP is we renegotiated the shortage sharing guidelines without ever implementing them. Mm-hmm. So we came to a point where the scientists said, we don't think this is going to be enough, and instead of having to prove that it wasn't enough by drawing down the lake and a multitude of other things, we instead took positive action, and there was all kinds of agreements that happened in advance of this or during the negotiation of the DCP. There was a MOU created among the 7 basin states and in the lower basin, and the lower basin states all contributed water to Lake Mead. There was a pilot system conservation program that took place to see if folks were interested in contributing to conservation in Mead. So there was a lot of things that happened in collaboration at the same time that we were renegotiating. And I think that same, and I would say we're on a roll, so to speak, of looking for positive ways to address this, collaborative ways. And I think that will continue. through this next 7 years of renegotiation and help inform that discussion.
And the DCP provided tools, and some of those tools are items that we're going to evaluate, and that will inform the conversation. So you basically have the prospect of improved modes and tools, and that can inform what happens going forward, and plus that effort to get things done together, and hopefully it'll help us to get through some, because these are challenging issues that we're going to have to talk about, and but I think that combination does provide us with a good basis in going forward.
Yeah, Tony.
Couple of, I hope, closely related questions to DCP. Yesterday, Mr. Babbitt said he had been hoping that the DCP discussions would lead to more serious looks either between or within the states of how water was used on the land, and he was disappointed to see that really didn't come about. And so I want to look ahead, ask you folks to look ahead, any of you, and say, in the next round of negotiations, for renewal of the renegotiation of the 2026 guidelines, do you think those negotiations are going to have to lead to how we're actually using water, and the next time maybe the cuts are going to have to be more significant? In Arizona, the only people whose day-to-day operations were really significantly affected by the DCP are the Pinal County farmers. The cities and the tribes gave up water, but from what I can tell, it's not affecting their day-to-day operations. Is that going to have to change?
Well, one of Governor Ducey's principles was that we would not establish the precedent into the out years, even before we arrive at the end of the interim period, that we're just going to mitigate forever. So we intentionally avoided, for one thing, you have resource limitations, and that was definitely an element in the mix. But we, as you've noticed, if you look at the tables that had been presented along the way, the water, the money, they don't go all the way through the 7-year span, and that was because we wanted to avoid that expectation that we're just going to continue to mitigate beyond the interim period. As far as what's discussed in the negotiations, that could come up. It's really not my place to say that's something, what the other states can or cannot inquire about, but those discussions are going to be open, and there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be discussed, and a lot of items discussed, and perhaps that'll enter into the mix. I don't know.
I think Arizona really does need to look at how water is used on the land, and I agree that it's important for all of us to do that. One of the biggest concerns that we have about the DCP is that it basically has sent a message that we can keep doing things the same way, right? So the message is to, if a particular interest is affected, get your lobbyists together and go in and just dig in, and then you'll get your mitigation, and next up they will be looking to import more water from outside the active management area. So it's the discussion about are there things other than alfalfa and cotton and some of the thirstiest crops, are there things that we can do to help transition away from those thirsty crops? It doesn't have to all be punitive. If you're gonna give money, maybe money for doing something differently would be a good way to look at it. And then obviously we have structural issues, like with the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District. You put the water in over here, but then you pump way over here, and and it's not sustainable, right? We just know that the mechanisms that we have set up for the way we're doing things are not sustainable. So I feel like it does have to be part of the conversation.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask each person up here, do you have a thought about what one thing would really help bring the Colorado River into balance in the long run? Is there anything that you tend to settle on as far as what really helps in dealing with a really complicated problem like this?
Great hydrology.
Ecological flows, recognizing ecological flows. How about that?
I don't think there is just one solution. I mean, it's a combination of different things. Like, for example, what Sandy says, changing the way we do things. We cannot keep doing the same thing and expecting to have different results. Hydrology will help, of course.
That was the easy answer. But the strategy's got to be more than just hoping, right? It's got to be.
Yes, no, we have to do something.
For,
and I think accepting, for Mexico, accepting a binational DCP was a step forward. I mean, we're doing something. We are acting on behalf of the basin. Okay.
And I would say, I think what we've seen is that it's hard, but it's the best option, and that's collaboration. After the good hydrology, it's the collaboration, because I think from the federal perspective, and this is what we've heard over and over again on our side, is that we want the states to decide what needs to happen. We want the intra-state water-using communities to make their own determinations about how to deal with these issues, as opposed to ending up with a top-down approach or in court or any of those other things, because we all know then that we end up with somebody else deciding, and that's not the best way forward. And so I don't think there's one thing either, and I think that's a really hard question, but I think that this continued collaboration and the continued discussion is the very best thing.
There is one more question here. I see we are out of time, but I want to give you an opportunity. Can you make it quick?
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of wanted to get y'all's thoughts as we look ahead to 2026 and kind of given the urgency of climate change and the way that the political environment is changing, not just in the United States, but also in Mexico. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on whether our political institutions are going to be able to keep up with kind of the changes that are taking place.
Well, they aren't right now. I'll just say that, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's complicated, but I would say look what's happening on Capitol Hill. We're going to have bill introductions early next week on the House and Senate side. One bill is going to be carried by a Democrat chairman, and on the House side, on the Republican side, or the Senate side, it's going to be carried by a Republican subcommittee chair. I thought that Ranking Member McClintock during the hearing on Thursday expressed things well when he talked about the diversity politically and all the rest. I'm just paraphrasing here. Across the basin, and we have this bipartisan effort where everybody's coming together to enable a certain outcome. I'm just kind of taking the broader thought that he was expressing there. But that was something that had been referenced time and again this last week, is this good outcome of bipartisan efforts. And it's great that we had cohesion among the 7 states, from California to Wyoming, very different states. And so that's been a test of the system, but appears the prospects for these measures are very good. And so I think that's encouraging. So
I think that we really need to do more to engage elected officials in in education, not just about water, but about climate change. And even the ones who don't want to talk about it or don't want to say it publicly, it's really important to have those conversations and try and find a way to have better informed people. Praying for water, praying for snow, that is not a policy. That is not something that is going to sustain us. And we have to stop saying, look, it's really complicated and it's really hard. So leave it to the experts. People need to be engaged. Yeah, it's complicated, but then again, it's not. Water is essential to life. You know, let's sit down and make sure that everyone is at the table and that they have the best information possible to make the best decisions possible.
All right, well, thank you very much to our speakers here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to move on to different voices on the Colorado River. And this group is very interesting because we're going to hear from people who work on the Salton Sea, people who work on the Upper Basin, people who work on tribes, people who have been working on the DCP and ag-related issues. And so I'd also like to start with Kevin and ask if each of you could take a couple of minutes to tell us about you and your work and how your work relates to the Colorado River and water issues in general.
Well, thank you, Ian. Kevin Moran, I'm the Senior Director for EDF's Western Water Program, and I lead our work in the 7 Colorado River Basin states. Recently, I was part of the Arizona Steering Committee process that produced the Arizona Implementation Plan, which was the foundation for Arizona's legislative action approving the DCP. So I was part of that process and represented 5 NGOs in that process. We would call ourselves Water for Arizona Coalition. Audubon, Western Resource Advocates, American Rivers, Business for Water Stewardship, and EDF. Our work involves work not only in Arizona toward moving toward balance in the lower basin and taking on the structural deficit in steps, but also in the upper basin. We're involved with working with Front Range municipalities on water leasing transactions that doesn't put agriculture completely out of business. Alternatives to buy and dry, which is almost never a good idea and certainly not a good idea for the environment. And we also have work that Michael Cohen has been deeply involved in much longer than EDF, but we are involved also in working on solutions to address and avert the environmental and health risks of a shrinking Salton Sea.
Thank you. And Lorelei Cloud from the Southern Ute Tribe.
Thank you. First of all, I think this is working. Happy spring, everybody. My name is Lorelei Cloud. I am the treasurer for the Southern Ute Indian Tribal Council. My tribe is located in the southwest corner of the state, along with our sister tribe, the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation, or Ute Mountain Ute Tribe. We're only one of 2 tribes in the state of Colorado. We have, I guess also I was the past chairman for the past 2 years of the 10 Tribes Partnership. And, but again, the partnership was created in 1992, and one of my tribe is part of that because we're off of we have senior priority rights off of the Salmón River, which is a main tributary to the Colorado River. But with our reservation is kind of unique because we have a checkerboard type land status, which means we have fee land integrated along with tribal land, so that kind of complicates some of our water issues and jurisdiction issues as well. But we also have 7 rivers that actually flow through my reservation, which is a little bit different than other reservations where, you know, maybe it's only one reservation or the water flows is close to the reservation. And so, but along with those 7 rivers, we still have a lot of area on our reservation that is dry. We actually have an irrigation project that's called the Pine River Indian Irrigation Project that is maintained and operated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And this is about 175 miles of canals and ditches, but only about 15% of this structure is actually in considered good condition. The rest of the 85% is either non-usable or is very much dilapidated. So we have a lot of different types of issues that we have on our reservation. We also have the Lake Nighthorse, which is also the Animas La Prada project. And we don't have proper infrastructure to take our water, our portion of the water. We have major rights within that reservoir, along with the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. But it sits on the dry side of our reservation. You know, we can drive by and see it, but we can't actually use it. And the city of Durango is actually using it for recreation, and which for the tribes, we also have an issue kind of with that, because we also come from a spiritual mandate. We rely heavily, you know, as a people on the spirit of the water. And so when we pray for the water. And so we have a complex issue, I guess, with water. You know, we need it for our spiritualness for Indian people. We need it for our ceremonies. We need it for drinking water. We know that water is an element that the Creator gave to us for all of us to share, and it is the essence of life. So, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim?
I'm Jim Lochhead. I'm the CEO of Denver Water, and my engagement on the Colorado River goes back to the early 1990s. The Secretary of the Interior has the authority in the lower basin to declare three conditions: shortage, normal, or surplus conditions. And up until the early 1990s, when reservoirs were full and times were good, the Secretary declared surpluses every year. And as a result of that, California, which is entitled to 4.4 million acre feet, was using about 5.3 million acre feet. As a result of the early severe drought in California in the early 1990s, California came to the Secretary of the Interior and asked for another surplus declaration. And at that point in time, Lake Powell was low, the upper basin was concerned, and so we said no. My position at the time was as the governor's representative for Colorado River on Colorado River negotiations. So each state has a governor's representative through which these negotiations are conducted. And we said no. And so sometimes you're lucky. The Secretary of the Interior at the time was, I think, the former governor of Arizona, who was receptive to the idea of maybe California using less water. And so the Secretary kind of scratched his head and he said, yeah, maybe I'll think about declaring normal conditions, which would put California off a cliff to immediately reduce its use down to 4.4. Well, fast forward 10 years of negotiations later, in 2001, in his last days, his last official act as Secretary of the Interior, underneath a banner that read "Peace on the River," Secretary Babbitt signed the 2001 surplus guidelines. That set the framework for California to negotiate the quantification settlement agreement, by which the transfer of water from IID to San Diego would occur. And kind of deja vu all over again, IID was the last holdout in that QSA, largely over Salton Sea issues, wanting assurances that there would be money available, and the state of California undertook an obligation to fund restoration of the Salton Sea. So that was implemented and done, and of course, no sooner had we finished those than in 2002, the current drought started. So we went from talking about surpluses to now talking about shortages. And that led to another series of negotiations and all the states lawyering up. And you know, we talk about the era of collaboration. These are really tough negotiations. There's no, it's not really a totally friendly environment in the room in these negotiations. And they are extraordinarily complex. But we negotiated the 2007 guidelines, which created ICS and some flexibility. It created the shortages based on the tiers in Lake Mead. It created a balanced operation between Lakes Powell and Mead. And I would say, relative to the discussion in the last part of this panel about, well, it came to be that those shortage provisions in the 07 guidelines weren't enough. We knew they weren't enough at the time. It was as far as we could get. I think what we didn't know is how soon we would kind of hit the wall in those shortage guidelines. And it's kind of shocking to me in terms of a long history on the river, and I never really thought in my career I'd be dealing with the situation that we're in right now. But to just give you an idea about the speed at which things could happen, we're having a good year this year, but if you started with today's reservoir conditions and you started with the hydrology beginning in the year 2000 and go forward, in 3 years Lake Powell will be dry under that particular trace of hydrology. It's not a prediction, but it's a possibility. It could happen, and it could happen very quickly, which is why we need to, as a basin, to act quickly and decisively in terms of actions to keep this system afloat. So in 2010, I engaged as the CEO of Denver Water. We'll get into this when we talk about the Upper Basin, but Denver Water receives about half of our water supply from the Colorado River, so we have a lot at stake at the top of the river in terms of, somebody mentioned sustainability, the long-term sustainability of this basin.
Thank you. Mike?
So I'm Mike Cohen with the Pacific Institute. Started with the Institute back in the beginning of 1998. And one of my initial tasks was to convene a conference, which we actually did down in Mexicali, I think. And to my considerable surprise, we invited all the major stakeholders, including states representatives. Bob Johnson, the regional director of the lower basin at the time, was invited. My boss at the time said, oh, just invite him, maybe he'll show up or he'll send a junior staffer. And Bob Johnson showed up to this, our little podunk little conference out in Mexico. And we had these conversations about the Salton Sea and the Colorado River. And it was my first, I guess, exposure to the idea that we could actually really engage with senior policymakers at that level and have real conversations about the river. Right around that time, there was a conversation about diverting flood flows to restore the Salton Sea. And we'd been looking at, the Institute put out a report in 1996 looking at the essentially the sustainable use of the lower Colorado River and talking about restoring the Colorado River Delta. And the idea that you would take water from a system that did not have water and deliver it to the Salton Sea seemed pretty shocking to us. So we started looking at the Salton Sea and realized that really nobody else was looking at the Salton Sea. So I thought, well, great, here's an excellent little niche for me to fill. In retrospect, 21 years later, I'm not sure that was the right decision because there's not been a lot of progress at the Salton Sea. But I've been working on that for quite a while and engaging in these various processes. And back in 1998, 99, they opened the public process for the surplus criteria. And then rather than just hammering them saying this is a terrible idea or you don't know what you're doing, we came up with an alternative. A group of NGOs at the time submitted an alternative saying the purpose and need here is too limited. Your scope is too limited because some of the basic needs for the Colorado River are not being met. The Colorado River Delta is largely dry. So how can we talk about surplus criteria when these basic needs are not being met? So we submitted an alternative to the process. And I think many people were a little surprised in the basin that we had this alternative. We were still told that we didn't meet the purpose and need, and we were sidelined a little bit. But it did develop the conversation that led to Minute 306. So here was an idea that if you open up the process and come with constructive ideas, there may be an opportunity to really engage on this. And then when the 2007 guidelines were being negotiated, we were an active participant in that. It was something of a dual track process because the states were having their conversations and there was a lot of shuttle diplomacy with Reclamation, but it was certainly not a fully open process because the tribes are not a major participant or not a participant in that discussion. But we again came up with some suggestions about conservation before shortage, some of which has been adopted into the DCP. And then again, we engaged, and I think to Reclamation's credit, in the basin study. I think we were pretty much full partners in the basin study and then the moving forward process to say, here's some different ideas, here's some different data you should be looking at, what are actual demands on the system? And the initial basin study came out and there were these, I would say, wildly inflated growth projections. So there was this idea that there's the supply-demand imbalance of 3.2 million acre feet, and there you may have seen this chart shown yesterday, because a lot of the agencies, and I think ultimately the agencies have a mandate to meet their customers' demands. But there's this disconnect between what's actually happening on the ground, and I think part of the narrative that might be useful or interesting to discuss a little bit about is this narrative about the DCP, because the idea is that there's a structural imbalance, but we're calling it a drought, and then we need to get more water back in the system to meet future population growth demands. But if you actually look at the growth in the basin, there's been a decoupling between population growth and water demand. So for example, Southern Nevada, between 2008 and 2018, population grew 300,000 people, right? An 18% population growth. Water demand in that time dropped by 30,000 acre feet, an 11% demand in total water consumption. Denver Water's done a tremendous job in reducing demand. John Fleck had a blog recently that city of Albuquerque has halved its per capita consumption. It's a 50% drop in per capita consumption. So there's a real success story, which I'm not sure has been fully discussed, about how well populations responded when presented with the idea that there's not enough water in the system. California, of course, there was a drought declaration, and people throughout the state of California largely responded by cutting their water use as much as 23%. So that's been a real success, but one of the challenges with the DCP has been it was started and we thought it was this kind of adjunct to the shortage guidelines, and therefore didn't need a full public process. And therefore a lot of the ideas that could have been brought to the table earlier were not brought to the table early enough, I think, and part of the messiness that we're seeing now, particularly the last minute, is a direct result of the fact that it was not an opportunity for people to bring this range of ideas early on. So certainly my hope is that the renegotiation is a more open public process. Certainly it's messy, but without the public process, it still took 6 years and it was still messy. So if you wind up at the same place, maybe it's better to bring people in at the beginning.
Thank you. And I'd welcome more discussion on that general topic, but first of all, I'd like to go to the issue of tribes and the role of tribes, the role that they can play in terms of talking about the Colorado River, and also sort of how it's worked historically, how things are changing, because in Arizona, for instance, the Colorado River Indian tribes and the Gila River Indian community are playing a big role in terms of contributing water to help make the deal work. So I wanted to ask if you could provide an overview from your time leading the 10 Tribes Partnership in terms of that, the water that they're entitled to, and how and what role they can play.
Okay, so you actually brought up a good point. The deficit in the water is 2.8 million feet or million acres. That's actually the same allocation that tribes have. The interest is 2.8 million acre feet. And so, that's kind of ironic, but, the roles that tribes can play is being at the table. All of these different parties are being planned, but tribes aren't being invited to the party. And so just being able to give us that invitation so that we can either say that we want to accept and be a part of the conversation, whether it pertains to us or not, I think we need to be able to have that opportunity. But the role that tribes can play is that, maybe that there is some type of water sharing, or that tribes can create some type of partnerships with other entities to help with their shortages, such as, like my tribe, we could potentially, I don't know if it's possible, but we could potentially partner with the city of Denver to help with their shortages, because we cannot, because of our failing infrastructures, use the full allocation of our water. And so tribes should be seen as a partner or a potential partner, a problem solver, instead of being seen as adversary or an afterthought. We should be included in the process, whether whether it really involves us or not. But we should be a part of that process somewhere.
And in terms of those obstacles, what types of solutions are you proposing or are you pushing for to be able to utilize more of the water and deal with the infrastructure problems that have just been sitting there for a number of years?
Well, there's, I guess, several impediments to that, because tribes in themselves have different issues going on, because most tribes don't have the adequate funding or resources to gain the funding to fix their failing infrastructures, or they may not even have an infrastructure in place at all. Like with our Bureau of Indian Affairs, they're so limited in the funding. With the infrastructure they have, they still maintain and operate it, and everybody that is a part of that system still has to pay the O&M charges, whether they get water or not. They still have to pay the full amount that is charged to them. But BIA itself is the government has really cut their funding, so they're not fully funded to be able to provide the services that they need to fulfill their trust responsibility for. And so a lot of tribes have that funding issue. They also have an infrastructure, again, issue, being able to move the water to where it needs to be so they can grow the crops and create an economy, is an issue. I think generally data collection also for tribes is a big issue. Most tribes don't have, again, the resources to be able to collect the data on their reservation or throughout their rivers. We actually are a little bit more progressive, and we actually went and we received a grant from the BOR, and we actually are monitoring some of our rivers. When the Gold Key mine spill happens, that happened and it went through my reservation. But it's just so happened that years prior to this happening, we actually started monitoring the Animas La Plata River. And so when this incident happens, the state and the EPA are actually using our data to make sure that the water is back to where it used to be, or even better to what it was before the mine or the spill happened. And so, again, there's a lot of impediments, but there's also a lot of solutions that the tribes could potentially play.
And how would that work? You were talking about the possibility of maybe working with Denver. How would that just physically work with?
So the tribes' allocations come directly from the state of Colorado. So, again, we don't know what that would look like. Sit down and having conversations. Kind of anything is possible. We really don't know, or my tribe really doesn't know the details from the Colorado River Indian tribes agreement, and also with Gila Rivers. And so each tribe is different. Each tribe has a different water settlement. Each tribe has different situations within their reservations. My tribe also we're very lucky because all of our water is settled and quantified. And so we could, even though we're down at the bottom of the state, and water just flows right through, and we're not able to use water across state lines, we could potentially come up with some type of a partnership where it's a win-win, and we're actually a part of a solution and not part of the problem.
What do you think, Jim? Is that something that you've talked about?
Well, let me talk a little bit about the Upper Basin DCP. So, unlike the Lower Basin, where you can forego uses and basically backwater up into Lake Mead, which is a relatively simple exercise. In the Upper Basin, we have 4 states, 4 different state water laws. We have Indian tribes. We have an Upper Colorado River Commission that manages the Upper Colorado River Compact. And Lake Powell is the bank account in which we deposit water in order to meet the collective obligation of the 4 states to not deplete the flow of the river below an average of 75 million acre feet over a 10-year running average. Lake Powell is, if it gets below that critically low elevation where it hits minimum power pool, it not only creates a hole that implicates the compact obligation of the Upper Basin states, but hydropower revenues are used for everything from endangered species protection programs, supplies power throughout the Upper Basin. It's a critically important resource. And so there are really only 2 ways to keep Powell above those critical elevations. And because of the 07 guidelines, Powell is essentially pulled down by Mead operations. So the structural deficit, as was alluded to before, becomes really important in this conversation. But that having been said, there are only 2 ways to manage Lake Powell. One is to move water from upper units of the Colorado River Storage Project system, Flaming Gorge, Navajo, and Blue Mesa, down into Lake Powell when Powell's in those critical elevations. The only other way is to reduce demands in the basin. And that involves taking existing uses and not using them, and having a verifiable way to account for and shepherd that water down to Lake Powell. Again, enormously complicated. And there do need to be conversations with the tribes in terms of participating in that basin-wide effort, because what we're talking about is temporary, voluntary, and compensated ways to create this water that can go into Lake Powell. And so this partnership between states, water users, tribes are going to be extremely important as we put this program together.
Thank you.
Yeah. One other comment. So like with my tribe and my sister tribe, the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, we have a really, really good relationship with the state of Colorado. And it's been years in the making, and we're so thankful that we have this because, again, most tribes don't have that relationship with their states. I think also one other a thing with that, just in the few recent years, the state has really tried to make sure that we were included in some of the conversations, and we really, really appreciate that effort that the state has made. So again, you know, there could potentially be other obligations or other situations where we can also help, you know, again with the state of Colorado. Again, some other tribes don't have that situation. Some tribes, you know, they also, their reservation is among three states. My sister tribe, the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation, they also have water rights within the state of New Mexico and the state of Utah. And they're not able to work efficiently with those other two states or be able to use the Colorado water to use in right across the state line. You know, it's an arbitrary line, but they're not able to use that water on that property. And so there's different situations that other tribes have. You know, my tribe just specifically has to be a little bit more fortunate than other tribes.
You know, Ian, you referenced the Colorado River Indian tribes and the Gila River Indian community. Just to confirm, and for everyone's awareness, the Arizona implementation plan, Arizona signing on as a good partner to the DCP, that would not have happened without tribal leadership. The Colorado River Indian tribes' participation and commitment to participate in system conservation, as Jim referenced, the voluntary compensated forbearance to put water in Lake Mead as part of Arizona's plan. The Gila River Indian community showed tremendous leadership and sophistication in making arrangements to market some of their higher priority supplies within central Arizona, in part for the Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District, which does enable new development, and that's an entity managed by the Central Arizona Project. And also by Gila River Indian community showing willingness to be part of system conservation and storage agreements through ICS going forward. So it just wouldn't have happened. And I think of Chairman Manuel and Governor Lewis, respectively, as Arizona leaders. That's what they are.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to transition to the Imperial Valley and the Imperial Irrigation District. There's no representative from IID here. I don't think that Mike can represent them. But they were not at the table at the end and did not agree. And one of the main things that their board of directors said was that this plan ignores the environmental and human health crisis at the Salton Sea. And then subsequently, what we've heard from other parties, including the federal government, is that this plan was really designed in a way that does not affect the Salton Sea, and but that it's an important issue. So I'd like to ask where you come down on that whole issue, just from a factual basis, in terms of the problems of the Salton Sea, what this plan does, if anything, and really, you know, what you're advocating for, what you think really needs to happen to address some of the issues there.
So that's a bit of a complicated question. Let me start with some of the, as I understand it, some of the background for the IID conversations. So the initial conversations was that IID was going to contribute 50% to as much as 85% of California's contribution to the DCP, which could have been, so at the lower elevations, if this severe stress hydrology recurs in the basin, California would be obligated to contribute as much as 350,000 acre-feet per year at these lower mead elevations. So 85% is a significant contribution from IID. And in those initial framing for IID's contributions, 350,000 acre-feet, or 85% of that, some 300,000 acre-feet, would have a significant impact on the Salton Sea, right? Because the Salton Sea relies almost entirely on these Colorado River inflows and the return flows from that irrigation. So that would have had a significant impact. So I've heard that there's a lot of frustration with IID that they didn't raise the Salton Sea concerns earlier, or that the facts have changed. But there were these initial impacts, and looking back even to 2016 CRUA, Kevin Kelly, the general manager at the time, said, we cannot proceed with DCP unless the Salton Sea is addressed. The Salton Sea is a critical part of the Colorado River Basin as a whole. And one of the real, I think, frustrations from IID, and there are many, is that IID has been making strides as part of the QSA, which again, they were forced into essentially against their will back in 2002, 2003. And in fact, a couple of the board members of IID lost their seats as a result of their votes to enact the QSA. So that's part of the history and the weight that IID board members bear, is that their farmers are not happy about it for a variety of reasons. The second part of that is that there's a new lawsuit. The Abadi family, joined by a number of the other farmers in the valley, sued IID, I think as far back as 2015. And then a little over a year ago, a local judge essentially upheld their claims. And as a result, IID was forced to throw out their equitable distribution program, which is a way, essentially a cap and trade system within IID, which enabled IID to target reductions, to improve efficiencies in the basin, to generate ICS, to help shore up Lake Mead. So that was thrown out. So IID was in a difficult situation to figure out how they're going to reallocate water, and it went essentially back to a historical use allocation, which meant that if some farmer is becoming more efficient, is conserving water in the valley, some other farmer can just take it, apply it to their own ground. So there's this specter of irrigation, the specter of litigation within the valley, and a lot of those farmers are, I would argue, pretty uncivil. So if you look at some of those board meetings online, there's a lot of screaming that goes on in the Imperial Irrigation District. Those board members feel that pressure, and then they're also being asked to contribute again. And there was a promise made by the state of California to essentially backstop the deal from the QSA to provide essentially mitigation funding, but projects at the Salton Sea. And administration after administration in the state of California failed to meet that obligation. So IID looks out at the Salton Sea and sees that the sea has dropped 8.5 feet, that some 20,000 plus acres of playa have been exposed, that dust emissions are increasing. We heard in January and through March of this year that 7,000 plus birds died there because the amount of habitat available to those birds is becoming increasingly constricted, increasing the incidence of disease, which is essentially what we were predicting 10, 15 years ago. So IID sees this as the backdrop. So the question is, as they renegotiated the deal, in fact, IID came up with a deal where they pay or essentially contribute the first 250,000 acre feet of California's contributions, and that's it. They're capped. So that new deal means essentially that because IID has already conserved that water, and it's in storage, some of it in Metropolitan, some of it in Lake Mead already, that under the new terms of the deal, had IID signed, there would not be additional adverse impacts to the Salton Sea. But the background to that is Metropolitan was going to assume essentially that 85% minus a little bit from Coachella and Palo Verde. And under this, again, this very bad hydrology, this stressed hydrology, California could be forced to donate or contribute 1.7 million acre feet, right? So that's essentially double Metropolitan's annual use. So the concern is if this very bad hydrology were to continue, Met would quickly deplete its total ICS credits. And then where are they going to go? Well, they're going to go to the biggest user on the Colorado River. So IID again would be asked to help contribute. So there's the background to it. And the challenge has been partly that they made this condition for participation in the DCP at their December board meeting, 2 days before CRUA, which caught everyone, including I think IID staff, unawares. But it essentially was this last minute demand. And yet, looking back again at that CRUA 2016 meeting, the general manager of the Metropolitan Water District got up and said, well, we have conditions precedent. We need you, the Colorado River community, to help get us to solve Bay Delta. So we're not going to sign DCP, and we're not going to sign it minute 32X until we get some relief on the Bay Delta. So there was another condition precedent expressed in front of 800 people at CRUA. And I'm sure there was a lot of backroom castigation of the general manager at the time. But what's been very different is the public vilification we've seen of IID since then. So we're hearing that Pinal County keeps coming back. We want a little bit more money. We need a little more of our needs met. But we're not seeing the same level of response to some of the Arizona parties that we're seeing to IID. And part of this is just personalities. IID's the biggest water user on the river. And this last minute demand, I think, has caught a lot of people unawares. People thought, well, there is no direct impact from DCP on the Salton Sea, so why are you raising this now? IID, of course, claims that we haven't solved the last problem. Why are we going to open ourselves up to a new problem when we haven't solved the last problem? And that IID has contributed essentially 500,000 acre-feet of water to meeting Metropolitan's needs, to meeting Coachella, to meeting some of the St. Louis Raid tribe. So IID is already contributing a fair amount of water to the system. And now they're being asked to take this next step and help backstop yet another deal. And I think instead of they're not asking for the money directly, they're asking for some response from the federal government to provide some funding for this major potential environmental catastrophe in the region. And I'll add one last thing because I'm perhaps going on too long, is that the federal government owns a lot of land at the Salton Sea. So it's not that there's no nexus there. 6,000 plus acres of land at the Salton Sea that have already been exposed are federal land. In the next 5 years, there could be another 3,000 plus acres of land, federal land exposed. So I think it's not unreasonable to say that there is a federal nexus there. There's a federal obligation there to help provide some mitigation for actions that have already taken. So, well, maybe I'll continue to go on. So the other challenge is...
But Mike, if I can just, I want to let you finish your thought, but I also want to ask you, because you talked about California's inaction, so apart from DCP, whatever happens with DCP, I think it would be helpful if you could explain, briefly, the Salton Sea, what do you think needs to happen there, and what if nothing happens and it just continues to deteriorate?
And the fact that there's money there that hasn't been spent.
That's exactly right. So there's, in various Salton Sea accounts, more than $500 million ready to be spent at the Salton Sea. And the problem with the Salton Sea, from the state of California perspective, has been a lack of political will. The good news is there's a new administration in California. The new secretary of the Resource Agency has made it very clear this is a high priority for the state to resolve Salton Sea issues. In fact, Secretary Crowfoot's first action as, I guess, appointed secretary, was to go down to the Salton Sea. There was a state water resources control board meeting last week. There's a new undersecretary, essentially the number 2, who went down there and expressed a strong commitment to moving things forward. And there's been meetings with IID to help resolve some outstanding issues there. So I think on the one hand, there's been real progress, or at least there's demonstration of real progress. We're 3 years behind where we should have been. The Brown administration did not prioritize it, but it looks like the new governor has really made this a priority. There's money to be spent, and frankly, there's now somebody there to crack the whip to make things happen. So I'm optimistic that there will be progress at the Salton Sea, which is why it's a little frustrating that IID was not, I don't know, coddled, maybe that's the word, because there could be progress seen at the Salton Sea, which could have assuaged some of the concerns from IID, allowing them to move forward on this. And instead, we have this, again, this disconnect where IID has really been vilified for not participating in this. And my water on the table comment is that IID, because of their various conservation efforts, could have another underrun this year on the order of 50 to 60,000 acre-feet, essentially, which is water that could have gone, had their DCP been signed or they participated, gone into Lake Mead. But given their current frustration with the rest of the basin, they may well find some other use for that water.
Well, I want to give everyone an opportunity to ask questions, so start collecting your questions, but I also want to ask Kevin, because he had brought up water leasing at the beginning. And so can you sum up for us what type of work you're doing to move toward water leasing, and how, because agriculture uses such a large share of the river, how can agriculture change to help address these problems?
Well, one area that's possible is through looking at the next generation of scaling up system conservation and demand management. I think that's one opportunity. We've seen in the pilot system conservation program in the Upper Basin interest of farmers and ranchers in participating in voluntary compensated conservation in ways that benefit the health of ecosystems and river systems. So I think that's one opportunity. I think a second opportunity is, I think part of what our group, our environmental table has articulated is, we think one of the wise responses to shortage and to greater volatility, call it, we're all part of trying to figure out what is the accelerated adaptation that we must have in the basin to climate change caused lower supply and volatility. We think one of the principles of that has to be flexibility. We think the DCP agreements take a significant step forward on that in terms of conservation incentives and flexibility. In central Arizona, what does that mean? It means let's find ways of allowing water users to share more of their supplies in flexible arrangements and not be so tied to legacy structures. We think that's preferable to seeking the next bucket of water from river counties, because we're concerned about the economic prospects and the future of river counties and the health of the river system. So we think adapting to shortage and volatility needs to involve greater flexibility and agility. And making that real in terms of agreements and how we adapt our agreements and structures in central Arizona, we think is important.
Thank you.
I would just add, in terms of that flexibility, it's something that I think is an important illustration of partnerships that have to occur in the basin. The System Conservation Pilot Program was a brainchild out of a meeting between myself and my colleagues at Metropolitan Water District, Southern Nevada Water Authority, and Central Arizona Project. And the states were getting nothing done in terms of moving forward in the negotiation post-2007. And we decided that somebody had to do something. And so we approached the Bureau of Reclamation and we said, what if we all put in some money into a pot and went out and tested the market and see if there's any interest among water users in the upper basin and the lower basin to be compensated to not use water. And that, in the upper basin, that created a firestorm of, okay, Denver water's in bed with Las Vegas, it's all a giant conspiracy and they're gonna come and steal our water. So we had to get through that. But the other thing that happened is that NGOs stepped up big time to partner with us in that program and developed on-the-ground relationship with farmers and built that program from the ground up. And it's been successful, I think, beyond anybody's wildest dreams. And so, again, I think it's an illustration at the sub-state level about how we can move together and partner to push policy forward.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to go to questions now.
Thank you. Michael, I guess I'm wondering what the difference is between the administrations then. Why would one be responsive to the Salton Sea and another not? Can you explain the politics behind that? And I guess for basin-wide, the politics of the basin, if the IAD is not is being have to dragged along 20 years ago to that QSA and is now kind of being left out, do they not have influence? Can you explain the politics of both of these?
How long do we have?
Let's start with the first question, which is probably easier. I think the previous governor had different priorities. He wanted to get water fix done. He wanted to get his high-speed rail done. And it simply was not a priority. And I think also at the beginning of the administration, it was seen as a crisis in the future. And typically, I think they're forced to respond to present crises. So they kicked it down the road. I think some of the personalities were different. The current governor has been down there and wants to solve issues. We'll see how long that lasts, but they have a lot more pieces in place now. So
So it's an opportunity for them to be seen as problem solving. That's the difference, because they're new and the other administration was on its way out.
And I think the new secretary had some familiarity with the Salton Sea and realized that there were some solutions available. That's my short answer to that. IAD, I think, as the largest user on the river, has been perhaps fairly or unfairly targeted or seen as having a target on their back for probably most of their history, certainly since there's been this effort to reallocate water. I think they had a successful transfer of water back in 1988-89 with Metropolitan, which was pretty much under the radar and helped them solve essentially an overflow problem into the Salton Sea. And then everybody else started thinking, oh, that's a great solution, let's come down. And the Bass Brothers went down there and thought, we're going to buy land and fallow it and sell off the water. And since then, it's been pretty much a steady stream of people coming in with schemes to take water out of the valley. So the people that are in there growing things are challenged by seeing their livelihood threatened and are resistant to that. I think there's been a lot of castigation of IID for being inefficient users of water, that alfalfa is shipped to China, or all these other themes that, or memes that continue to persist, that they're not productive users of water, even though that's their water, and essentially under the property rights system, they can do with it what they want. Also, it's because of this, I think, years of being targeted, it's created a very insular mentality, and they tend to see other people coming after them as rather than being collaborators. And I think that's been reinforced by these recent conversations where essentially they've been castigated for not participating, rather than being acknowledged for their previous efforts and saying, we're going to work with you even though it might be on a slightly different timeline to provide that on-ramp for you to get to the DCP, which they strongly want to do because they want that additional storage in Mead because it provides them with that same kind of flexibility to conserve water and use it in future years, or the flexibility that they want to have and be able to store the water in Mead. So they want to do it, but I think like most people, they want to be acknowledged for having their own interests. And the current conversation, I think, is really going to set us back quite a bit, and there's going to be a lot of work need to be done to repair those relationships.
Jim, do you want to take
Well, there's no doubt that it's a dysfunctional relationship between IID and the rest of the basin. And, you know, like any dysfunctional relationship, I guess the behaviors keep perpetuating themselves. And, I mean, the bunker mentality in IID has been there. It was there before all this started in the 90s because they hated Metropolitan, and they were very protective of their rights. And we have this history of the rest of the basin getting 99% of the way there, and IID being the one party at the very end of the day that is the holdout that literally threatens to take the entire system down based on their unilateral demands. And whereas, I mean, the rest of the basin is compromising and working. So, you know, there's a IID story. I'm not pointing at you, but there's an IID. The story was told about IID. And then the rest of us kind of look at them and scratch our heads and think, you know, how can this happen? That we're essentially held hostage at the very end of the day by the unilateral demands of the biggest water user with the senior water right on the system.
All right.
I actually was going to ask a similar question about IID's sort of influence and power. I guess I'm curious, you know, maybe Jim, you wrote a letter last year.
And just to give folks, so we stay on schedule, and I appreciate all your interesting questions. We do have about 3 minutes left for our time slot.
Okay.
So, but please bring them on.
I guess for anyone, I'm curious with all these sort of conditions, and I was thinking of the sweet spot last year. We're talking a lot about collaboration, but it's a really messy process. So what is the give and take between some of the conflicts and public sniping and collaboration?
Well, I think you need action forcing events. So the lowest common denominator is that everybody's going to hold their cards and sit across the table and look at each other until there's something that makes things happen. And the sweet spot incident was kind of a perfect opportunity to create an action forcing event. And journalists played a big part in that by covering those stories. And I think that each one of these paths forward that we've described on the river has had some place where the Secretary of the Interior comes in or something happens that moves the needle forward.
So I want to repeat my question from the previous DCP session to these people that I put to Sandy Bahr and Clint Chandler and so forth, which is, so Babbitt said he thought this round was going to get to people looking at how we use water on the land, and now the implication is, he said that didn't happen. Is it going to happen the next round? Are more people going to have to make sacrifices the next round? Or are we going to be able to do this without sacrifice among the people living in the basin?
So I'll just mention that Pinal County, in the new world of the DCP, is in 1 year or in 3 years will be fallowing between 20 and 40% of the irrigated lands right now.
Yeah, I mentioned
so then,
in my question.
yes.
Beyond the farm, but go ahead. Yeah.
So the question becomes, how does that happen? How does that happen in ways that don't create worse haboobs, worse dust problems, impacts to bird habitat, which is, there's not insignificant bird habitat in Pinal County. How does it happen in a way that sets the table for a more sustainable agricultural economy with less surface water? That's where our friends in Central Arizona are headed. And so I would suggest that while it's not officially part of the Arizona implementation plan, that those issues are going to be very much part of how we have to operate in reality. And so certainly EDF and others are going to be part of that conversation. Just one of the many unfinished business elements of Arizona water that we still have to work on.
Well, did anyone else want to add anything to that?
I guess my experience has been that despite the talk of the connections between land use and water, and there's a complete disconnect. We have land use authorities that approve development, and you have water utilities who are expected to just go find water and endlessly supply it, which of course we can't. Until we develop that connection, water is not going to, in my opinion, going to affect growth in land use and populations moving into areas. I mean, you see it all over the place with groundwater overdraft and other issues. And so we need to deal with the implications of demand management in terms of its impact on rural communities in particular and the environment. But I don't think it's going to stop or really drive growth patterns in really a meaningful way.
All right, well, thank you very much. This has been a terrific discussion. Let's give them a round of applause.
Okay.
Thank you.